Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tiffany Minton, and I will be your host and moderator today for this webinar/seminar. Thank you for joining us for this virtual event. So a little bit about me briefly. I'm a professional musician based out of Nashville, Tennessee, but I'm currently working on my master's degree in public history at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro. I am also the primary oral historian working on the project that we will be discussing a little bit later on. Since 2019, I have had the great privilege of working as a graduate assistant at the Center for Popular Music on the campus of MTSU, who are the virtual and real hosts of today's seminar. The CPM is one of the world's oldest and largest research centers devoted to the study of American folk and popular music. The CPM's mission is to promote research in American vernacular music and to foster an understanding and appreciation of America's diverse musical culture. The archive at the center holds over 1 million items in formats that include sheet music, songbooks, sound recordings, video recordings, manuscripts, photographs, periodicals, posters, catalogs, and various other things I have not mentioned. The center's reading room offers a reference collection of scholarly books and maintains periodical subscriptions covering a wide range of scholarly, professional, and consumer publications. So the CPM is not just for college students. The CPM is also open to all community members and international researchers as well. So today we will be talking about an exciting historical project and new archival collection coming to the CPM that's called the Women Musicians in Nashville Oral History Project. This project is a collection of 15 oral history narratives from some of Nashville's most respected, prolific, and perhaps most unsung sidemen. Because there are many stories yet to be heard, the project exists in perpetuity and will be added to over time. Our panel discussion today centers this new collection of oral histories forthcoming to the CPM. Please visit the CPM's website, which is at mtsu.edu/popmusic, and follow their social media for future updates on the accession and availability of this project. Thank you to my colleagues at the CPM for helping make this event tonight happen, or tomorrow in the morning, whenever you're looking at this later on. And special thanks to Dr. Martha Norkunis at MTSU, who advised on this project, Dr. Sherry Tucker at the University of Kansas, who served as a mentor. And thanks again for all of you out there in the virtual world who are watching this. So another brief introduction. Nashville's history with sidemen is well trodden. There are dozens of stories out there about the behind the scenes players who've made our current live and recorded music possible for the music industry and for the general audiences that enjoy it. Some of these stories include things you may be familiar with, like the Nashville Cats, which is an all-male band of session players who backed records for Bob Dylan, Neil Young, the Byrds, a couple members of the Beatles, and various other people back in the 60s and 70s. Or perhaps you know about the Nashville A-Team, which is a set of studio players who backed hits for Elvis Presley, Patsy Cline, Brenda Lee, and so many more. The A-Team was disproportionately male, but there were some notable exceptions, including the guitar player Velma Smith, and the vocalists, the Anita Kerr singers, and harpist Mary Allen Hoetfinger. But the history of the sideman in Nashville is a history primarily told through the eyes of men and about men. So working outside the boundaries of the terms gendering and positioning, the sidemen that we will be talking to from the Women Musicians in Nashville Oral History Project transcend the term. First of all, they are not cisgender men, and they don't just work next to the stars they support. True, many of these women have been working for decades at their craft as for-hire musicians, session players, and live performers. However, each of them has carved out an autonomous space beyond the limits that we know as this free agent musical archetype in the industry. They are also producers, songwriters, voiceover actors, DJs, small business owners, educators, public servants, authors, and so much more. Each of their careers and lives as musicians is unique and interesting, but also deeply intertwined. Individually and collectively, they are part of sort of the invisible hand propping up the current and historical culture of a very complex entertainment industry, not just in Nashville, but in other states, other cities, and around the world. And that industry is not just for country music in Nashville in particular. It is so much more than that. So you may not know who they are, but that's because they're hiding in plain sight. And so before I introduce you to a few of them appearing on our panel today, I want to introduce you to Dr. Kristine McCusker, who is here to illuminate some of the historical ideas and questions that give context to this collection and our discussion. Dr. Kristine McCusker is an ethnomusicologist and popular music historian at Middle Tennessee State University. And she's the author of many works, including the book Lonesome Cowgirls and Honky Tonk Angels, about the women of barn dance radio. And she's also the co-editor of 2 collections on the history and state of gender in country music. One called Boy Named Sue, Gender in Country Music, and Country Boys and Redneck Women, New Essays in Gender in Country Music. She is currently working on 3 publications, one titled Just Enough to Put 'Em Away Decent, about death rituals, life extension, and the emergence of the modern South in the first 50 years of the 1900s. She's also doing a piece on Bobby Gentry that's called Bobby Gentry's Odes to Mississippi, a musical biography of place, and one on the Dixie Chicks, who are now changing their name and are known as the Chicks. That piece will be called Dixie Chicked, Sony versus the Chicks and the Regendering of Country Music in the Early 21st Century. Her other work includes contributions to PBS and NPT. She's also worked with the Smithsonian Museum, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Library Association, and currently she's the co-executive director of the Oral History Association, and she is also a professor of history at MTSU. Please welcome Dr. Kristine McCusker.
Thank you.
Our next, thank you for being here, Dr. McCusker. Our next panelist is Megan Coleman. Megan is a musician, drummer, vocalist, and DJ. She's a session player and has recorded in famed studios like the Bomb Shelter and the Sound Emporium. As a performer, she's played behind artists such as Grateful Dead member Bob Weir, legendary background vocal group and gospel singers, the McCrary Sisters, singer-songwriter Ron Pope, Jackie Green of the Black Crowes and Trigger Hippie, and as a performer, she appears regularly in the all-women supergroup called The Girls of Nashville, which is a live show featuring many singer-songwriters from the Nashville community, including Lori McKenna, Caitlin Smith, Maren Morris, and so many others. As a DJ and drummer, she's featured regularly at dance parties like Funky Good Time, Bitch Fit, and Pronoun Party in Nashville. She recently appeared on the stage with English musician Yola. She was the drummer and background vocalist on their Nina Simone performance To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which aired on The Late Show with Seth Meyers. She's from Detroit. She also speaks Arabic. Please welcome the multi-talented artist, Megan Coleman.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for being here, Megan.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Yes. Our second panelist is Ellen Angelico. Ellen is a multi-instrumentalist who plays guitar, banjo, mandolin, bass, pedal steel, piano, and pretty much anything else with strings. But I've also heard her play the kazoo and the glockenspiel, and both were riveting. So her session work includes features on dozens of Americana, pop, country records. She has had multiple appearances on the famed Grand Ole Opry stage with artists like Kaylee Shore. Most of her past work includes playing behind artists like Ty Herndon, Lily Hyatt, Sonia Lee, Sarah Potenza, Uncle Cracker, Wheeler Walker Jr., and so many other people you may or may not have heard of. Ellen is super prolific in this town. Her current work includes playing auxiliary guitar for pop country artist Cam, and the Nashville scene has called Ellen an ace of all things stringed and one of the greatest utility players in Nashville. Ellen also works at Nashville's most comfortable music store, Fanny's House of Music, and received accolades there as Best Instrument Salesperson from the writers of the Nashville scene. This year, she was nominated for Instrumentalist of the Year at the Americana Music Association's 19th Annual Honors and Awards, which by the time this airs We will have found out what the results are. Good luck to you, Ellen. Please welcome Ellen Angelico.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, Ellen. And last but not least, Judy Rodman is here with us. Judy is a music industry heavyweight, and with a career spanning 6 decades. Her work includes being an award-winning vocal coach, solo recording artist, stage and television performer, public speaker, author, multi-genre hit songwriter, studio producer, vocal consultant. It goes on and on and on. She previously was an MTM Records recording artist, and she had chart-topping country singles for them. She is also an Academy of Country Music Award winner. She received Top New Female Vocalist in 1986. Some of her many clients and collaborators over the decades include a wide variety of people such as Dolly Parton, Ann Peebles, George Jones, Elvis Presley, Brenda Lee, Ray Charles, Carla Thomas, Casey Musgraves, Dave Ramsey, Adia Victoria. It's endless. With thousands of studio credits as a lead and background vocalist, she's done jingles, songwriting demos, master albums, you name it. She's done it all. A personal favorite of mine is her BGV work and hand clap credits and snaps on Dolly Parton's 1983 record, Burlap and Satin. I really love Potential New Boyfriend. It's a great disco country song. She's also the creator and host of All Things Vocal podcast, which is available wherever you can stream a podcast. Everyone, welcome the legendary Judy Rodman.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. And for all of you that have contributed to this project, who may be watching, I appreciate you as well. We look forward to hearing from you panelists today. So to begin our panel discussion, let's get some historical grounding for the audience, some people out there who may not be totally familiar. I'd like to ask some questions of Dr. McCusker first. Dr. McCusker, can you briefly define what oral history is and its general usefulness in the practice of what you do as an ethnomusicologist who studies popular music history?
Sure. And I'm really grateful to be here and in such auspicious company as well. So thank you for inviting me. Oral history began as a profession, as a professional society in the 1960s because it was a direct intervention into the historical process. And it gathers information and stories from narrators who are typically sidelined in the official records, which tend to be based on written documents and written documents in English. And so it is the ultimate democratic practice because of that intervention, because if everybody's got a story, then everybody deserves a place in our national narratives or whatever narrative, historical narrative that we're working with. So oral history plays a phenomenally important part in the kind of work you're doing, Tiffany, because ethnomusicology, the study of people making music, requires that intervention because the narratives in country music argue that beginning in 1984, when Bill Malone wrote his Country Music USA, women sat on porches and sang to babies, men went out and made money. The problem was that there was a source material problem. There were records you could listen to, but it turned out the majority of women in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s were radio musicians. And so by doing oral history, it recovers, it's that direct intervention that says, here are some new sources that can teach us a different story about the past and cause us to rethink and bring actors from the sidelines into the center. And so in 1998 and 1999, I did 6 hours of oral interviews with Rosalie Maphis, who with her husband, Joe Maphis, did Dim Lights, Thick Smoke, and Loud, Loud Music, one of the best honky-tonk songs ever from the 1950s. And Mrs. Maphis's discussions with me allowed me and her to say, the official narrative looks a bit different when you start listening to female musicians' voices and to their experiences. And it requires us to take them from the margins and put them smack dab in the middle of the story.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned a few things about why, but can you just recap for us more specifically, why are the oral histories of women, and I would say, thinking about women in its broadest context, women of different races, ages, all of that, why are their oral histories particularly important to the study of popular music more broadly, maybe across the humanities?
Yeah, again, it's this notion of a public official record, that public official record tends to value white cisgender men in that record. Whereas music making, if we ask the basic question of an ethnomusicologist, and that is, how is music made and why is it made that way? We automatically leave a primarily commercial process and start looking for the dailiness of everyday music making. Not one of these musicians in this video right now grew up walking straight into a commercial practice. They started within their families. I did, and learned that music is made in the moment and then has potential for other opportunities. So the Bobby Gentry work that I'm working on, Ode to Billy Joe, is a biography of Greenwood, Mississippi. It talks about growing up in Greenwood, Mississippi in the 1950s in the midst of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, and the different sort of tensions that were going on there in this place, and that sort of ordinariness of music making becomes part, you can hear it in the song once you are aware of that ordinariness. And the big fancy historical word is quotidian, daily practices. And once you understand those daily practices, you can begin to understand the commercial end of it much better.
Thank you for that insight. As a scholar of country music, can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of women in the role of sideman, and maybe a little bit more about how that role has developed or changed over time for women in country music more generally?
Sorry, my daughter is grabbing the dogs. You know, welcome to Zoom world, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
So the whole idea, at least in the context of the research I've done, the whole idea of and just assume every time we say the word sidemen, there are air quotes going on here, that there was no notion of sidemen in country music in the 1930s and 40s in its earliest iterations, because going on to these stages, and they're very informal country square dance stages, and then that gets enacted on radio afterwards. You went in as a member of a family. You went in as a known human being, that those authentic relationships, however inauthentic they were, with the radio performers and their audiences, everybody knew everybody. So Tiffany, if you would show the Cumberland Ridge Runners for me, that one photo. These are the Cumberland Ridge Runners from Chicago's WLS radio station in the 1930s. I can tell you the name of every single one of them. Some of you may recognize, to the right of the screen, with the gate, that's John Lair. The other way to, next one over. That's Red Foley, who was really famous on Grand Ole Opry as its master of ceremonies in the 1940s and 1950s. But he's standing between, Carl and Hardy are standing there, John Lair is there, the man on the floor is Slim Miller, and Hugh Cross is holding the banjo next to Red Foley. And the audience knew every single one of these people, even as they were backing the woman who is here, and her name was Linda Parker. Now there's some substantial fictions going on in this photo. Linda Parker is not her real name, and she isn't the kind, good sunbonnet girl. But because the side men were known, this whole idea of this invisible group of people who are heard but not seen or known is a farce in these early days. Could you also show the Coon Creek Girls next? But And with this photo, this is the Coon Creek Girls. Two of the musicians are family. The one holding the guitar, the other one holding the fiddle. And the other two women were sold as being neighbors. They weren't great, but they were supposed to be neighbors of the two sisters, and but they all played musical instruments and their names were known. But the other thing here that you should notice is that they're instrumentalists. There's no sense that only men play instruments. And so Lily Mae Ledford, who eventually became a Smithsonian Folk Fellow, she's the one holding the fiddle. She won all sorts of fiddle contests, and her moniker on radio stations was the Banjo Picking Girl. And so it's not just that everybody was known, but that there was a sort of free-for-all in the instrumentation. Anybody could play these musical instruments until the 1950s, when the solo performer became more a part of the shift from country music on the radio to country music on records and on television. And so that's where the A-Team comes out. So, and it's also the addition of new instruments that were associated with men: electric guitars, drums, except we have two drummers in the room right now, right? And they would be gendered as masculine. Now, that doesn't take for granted that Mary Chapin Carpenter played an electric guitar. The Dixie Chicks were virtuosos, the Chicks, excuse me, are virtuosos. The High Women, Brandy Carlisle's on piano, Amanda Shires is on violin. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But this sense that men become the professional musicians and women are solo singers, backup singers, that the voice is their instrument exclusively. That's really a function of the 1950s, and certainly is influenced by Ward and June Cleaver, in the sense that men work, women keep the home, or they might sing. Or at their Felice Boudreau, she would write some lyrics and then go shopping for some spaghetti.
Interesting. Well, thank you for giving us more context to that. What you're painting more specifically is a picture that, you know, women began in country music specifically as generally known and part of the discourse. Something shifted in the mid-last century, and perhaps the wider culture or the specific culture of the country music industry or the zeitgeist of Nashville, something about that hasn't caught up with its origins to reframe the narrative, which of course is one reason why this project exists. But before we move on, is there anything else about the side man or side player, as we're going to sort of recast it? Is there anything else about that term that you think is important for us to understand in the study of popular music in Nashville music culture, or somehow in the more broadly?
Well, I will mention that Travis Steinling, who teaches at the University of West Virginia, just put out a book about the Nashville Cats. And so this narrative of the men are the professionals and the women are the mommies sort of narrative, I fully expect this oral history project, Tiffany, to tell us we're both flat out wrong. And I really welcome that opportunity to see the ways that these oral histories that you've done are a direct intervention into that narrative.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing how it fits in also. That is yet to be known, but the purpose and intention is hopefully that scholars and journalists and just people generally interested in music history, is particularly more recent music history, meaning 1950 to now, will take a look at the project, listen to the stories, and get a better, broader, more specific understanding about what women as side players have been doing in Nashville for a long time and continue to do today, probably in larger amounts than ever. I don't know. I don't study the numbers particularly, but maybe someone will also do that. That would be great. So let's switch our attention over to some of our panelists for a minute, and just maybe go around, starting with Ellen. And can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be in your profession as a side player. Maybe describe a little bit of your experience for people out there who might be unfamiliar with how you do your job as a side player.
Yeah, I would describe the sideman role as any kind of job playing or singing music that doesn't involve being the primary artist. It's a supporting role, not the star of the show, and it generally connotates being involved with live shows in some way. Lots of sidemen are also involved with being session musicians, i.e. playing on recording sessions, but in Nashville especially, there is a recording scene and a touring scene, and they don't often overlap.
Thank you. Judy, do you have anything to add? You've done this work for, over 5 decades now, and your professional work is varied amongst the entertainment industry. Would you add anything about your experience as a side player, kind of illuminate maybe some of that for us?
Sure. When I moved from Memphis to Nashville in 1980, there were 3 groups pretty much doing everything. And in that time, every record on every major label had a background group. They didn't do their own backgrounds. They had background singing groups. And one of them was Herschel Wigginton's Nashville Edition, which had 2 female members, one of which was a woman that I had sung with in Memphis. Another one was headed by a woman who really is a legend named Leah Jane Barinati. And the other one was the Anita Kerr sisters were a little bit before us. And we worked with a lot of those singers that I worked with Louis Nunley, who was part of that. And then the third one was the Cherry Sisters. Lisa Silver was part of that, and a couple of other people that have moved on. But the thing is that Leah Jane Barinati, oh my God. I mean, she fully a third of all the hits that were done for decades. She arranged the background vocals. She was the one that I was lucky enough to substitute in all those groups because I had been a session singer in Memphis, and we needed to do that. So, and my goodness, these singers definitely are unsung. And the reason I believe is that what they did we used to sing so much there was so much background vocal work that we would start at 10 in the morning and go till 1 o'clock in the next morning. We would do 10, 2, 6, 10, and literally there would be oxygen tanks that people, this was a little bit before I came, but the background singers would breathe in, before their 10 o'clock because it was so incredibly exhausting. But if there was that much work, and Leah Jane was so much a part of that. But I think that it wasn't really put down as history because it wasn't, they had instrumentalists on the CMAs and things like that, but not the background vocals. For some reason, they left them out. And now that they were working before the digital age, and when everything is written down and everything is recorded and all that. But if you did some backgrounds on Leah Jane Barinati and these other background singers, I was lucky enough to be able to step in 1980 at the time where they were there. So they're definitely considered sidemen, I suppose, because they were on everything. And we were on the simul sessions, the live sessions, and everything. We were part of we felt like we were part of the musicians. There was just all kinds of commingling going on because we usually worked at the same time. And so that's what I would add.
Thank you. I think what you're pointing out is this distinction between musicians wasn't much in the same way that genre is touted as a distinction in the music industry, that the sense of who is a real session player, more authentic or recognizable player or side person, the distinction between musicians is perhaps not as stark historically or currently, but somehow the narratives about what you do have either intentionally or unintentionally excluded women from men within that world. So thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's an interesting point to get across too, especially for people out there who may be watching this and thinking about how this could relate to research they might want to do, which is that women have been here this entire time, and yet somehow, like I said earlier, hiding in plain sight for a lot of scholars or people who are fans of popular music. So thank you for that. Megan, would you describe a little bit about the work that you do and maybe talk about your perceptions about the work that you do and kind of the culture or community surrounding the work that you do as a side player?
Yeah. First of all, thanks again for having me. I appreciate being here and hearing all these stories. And I think Ellen and I have played together a bunch. So she touched on a lot of what I do as well, which is like just coming in, and a lot of my bread and butter is last minute things, you know, kind of the readiness, I think, of being a side player. And I think how like specific that is to like Nashville players, just like, you know, it's kind of expected that if you, especially in like country music and such, just like that you are going to be called sometimes an hour before a show and expected to play everything perfectly. And so a lot of what I have grown to love and hate over the last couple of years is being able to do that. And, you know, I grew up playing in church, so there's always on that level too, like some level of like just being ready to play whatever with whoever. And I'm grateful for that background because it's helped me immensely. And just like being able to jump on stage, watch someone's butt from the, you know, from the drums and kind of know what's going on and where we're going. So that's a lot of what I do is coming in last minute and being expected to pull off something close to, you know, perfect to like what the record is. Or sometimes it's like, you know, this has never been played before, just here, you know, have at it kind of thing. So that is what I always understand my role to be, is just like making sure that I'm supporting the artist and, you know, and the other artists and musicians on stage. And yeah, as a drummer especially, you know, and you understand, like just making sure that I'm holding everything together is kind of my role.
Yeah, not just keeping the beat together, but knowing what your place is, but also knowing what's expected of you. And I think you bring up a really good point about the level of musicianship that exists for a side player, and the caliber of that being extremely high. And I think what you could say extremely high in Nashville, particularly because the industry here is not just country music and hasn't been for a long time. So you have to be able to move between styles of music. Sometimes you're even moving between gigs in the same night. As you all have done this more than once, I'm sure, 2 or 3 gigs in the same night, all different music. You have to know it, you have to be prepared. And so what you're describing to us is, I think, something that is in some ways quintessentially Nashville, but often translates to other part of the industry as well. But the amount of music venues we have here, the amount of different kinds of artists we have here, your work is extremely varied and exists on a really high level of playing. So thank you for sharing all of that. I would like to ask another series of questions really quick before we move on, but how would you describe how the musical culture in Nashville and its relationship to women as side players or just general musicians, how is the culture around that changed, shifted, evolved, not evolved? What is your sense of when you first got here and you began working as a woman in music? Of course, you just see yourself as a player, but how has that sense of your gender and all of that changed over time the longer that you've done this? Let's start with Ellen.
That's an awful large question.
Yeah.
I think it's been hard for Nashville to break out of women musicians being a gimmick. I've experienced it a lot in my career. occasionally hilariously when I'm hired for something because they need a female pedal steel guitar player, and then I show up with a decidedly masculine presentation. So the motivations, are often quite visual. And it's easy to feel like a sideshow or a way to check a diversity box, even today. And I see it getting better. I that there would be no reason for people to not hire me. What I didn't see coming is how much more of a slog it would be for me than my white male colleagues, who often landed high profile gigs within 4 or 5 years of being here. And I just got my first salaried gig at the beginning of this year after living here for a decade. And adding a Black, Indigenous, or person of color identity to the mix sets you back even farther, because there's ageism at play too. So if it takes you longer to get a gig, and then you get a gig, and by the time you're old, I mean, touring folks often employ men in their 40s, but the only woman over 45 that I can think of who's touring with a current act is Catherine Marks, who plays keys for Reba and is a wonderful human being, but has had that gig for many, many years. So it's changing for the better in really, really small ways. And I think it's going to take quite a large shift to get the music culture of Nashville to break out of this idea of women being a gimmick. Still today, if you have a woman sideman in a major band, they are often the only one in the band. Actually, I can't think of a single band that has 2 women, a major mainstream pop country act. So it's gonna take some pretty systemic change to shift that paradigm.
Thank you for that insight, Megan. And I hope this doesn't bury the lead too much, but you talked about this in your oral history, which is this idea that you would be the duality of being hired and fired for the very same things that you bring to a gig. And I'm thinking about how that relates to this question. Can you describe about your experience with how your identity intersects with what you do as a professional, and how that's maybe affected your career, or how you see it shifting in the culture in Nashville?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like you said, I have been hired and fired for the same things. I get hired for like, wow, we want this like soulful Black female from Detroit, and like all of this like energy that that apparently I don't give off in real life but do on stage. And and then I've noticed often, especially when it comes to working with female artists, and oftentimes it's not always the case, but ones that are like a little bit older too, there's this feeling of like, oh well, the drummer's kind of like stealing the attention from this situation. So and that's not always directly said, but every time it is the thing, I immediately know that it's a thing, and so I think, like, when I first moved here, and I would tell people that I was a drummer, they're like, oh, that's so cute. I bet you are. And so, like, I really resonate with Ellen, where I'm like, well, if I just like do my job really amazingly, then no one can deny me, the best gigs, if I'm just like bringing my A++ game to the table. And I, and so I have all these like anxiety-ridden preparations of shows that were with 3 hours notice kind of thing. And it still ends up being that like Ellen mentioned, I see people who are like my white male colleagues who've gotten like just these incredible gigs, and I'm like, wait, I played with that person though, like, you know what I mean? So yeah, I see I think I see it changing as far as like women as a whole, but from a Black female perspective, I don't see it shifting that much. I can think of maybe 2 Black females in Nashville who who get called for like side piece kind of things, or sidemen kind of things. And, and even those gigs are not necessarily like of huge like notoriety kind of thing. So I think that it is still kind of gimmicky, and even with Black women, with women of color, with, it's even more so that it's less likely that you're going to see that kind of person on stage. I am almost always the only one. And I'm used to being the only female, but it's very often that even when there's like other females around, I'm almost always the only woman of color. So I think that it's still, at least from my perspective, has a long way to go in that regard. Specifically in Nashville, I can't speak for other places, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, sounds like it. Thank you for sharing that. Judy, before we move on, I want to hear briefly from you, because you have the most experience of any panelist here today as far as how long you've worked in the industry, and you have told us about specifically women as background vocalists and how they have sort of dominated that specific field as musicians. But what is your perception of how the industry has changed or not changed for women in your position as long as you've been working in Nashville, or just as long as you've been doing this? Because you did do it in Memphis before you came to Nashville.
Right. And I do have something that's a little bit different on this panel in that I'm 69. And so I have seen radical changes, most of them for the better. I moved from Memphis, which is where I fell in love with R&B and had many, African-American friends, and worked in the industry with, on Stax and different places like that, as a background singer on records. And when I moved to Nashville in 1980, there were literally Ku Klux Klan handing out pamphlets on the corners of Music Row, which blew my mind. Okay, we had that tiny little airport, and this was Redneck City. It really was. Well, it's not far enough yet, but it's a long way from where it was, and I'm happy to see the changes to the point where, when a studio closes down, like Sound Shop or RCA, one of these iconic studios closed down, they're closing down a lot of history. And the truth is, I know that it's kind of sad, but in a way, I don't miss it one bit, because it represents some things that are not in my value system. And so I'm really glad to see, I think that things really are going to be opening up, both for women of color, for the gender differences, it is so much better than it used to be. And I'm hoping that it continues. The other thing that's changed a lot, I know we've got to move quickly, but is the songwriting and the messaging that comes from women. Before, it was really like the men's, dream of what the lyrics should be from their women. They want, to hear this certain thing from women. And that's what women's lyrics were about. Well, Loretta Lynn sort of started changing that with the pill and different things like that. And I became an artist because my producer, I decided I didn't want to sing what was being written. So I was writing my own messages. So that's changed a lot too. And if you look around at what's going on being said now, you can definitely see that the messaging is changing from women.
Thank you for that reminder that maybe the arc of justice doesn't totally bend towards progress, but when it does, it is slow but steady. And in a place like Nashville, small changes can be huge changes. So thank you for that reminder.
Hang in there.
And, yeah. Thank you. And for the reminder that, there are amazing and talented and interesting women making music that exists outside of the paradigm of what we're now calling bro country that sort of dominates the discourse in the field of country music, but that there are women out there doing very different work and very valuable work. So thank you. Dr. McCusker, before we get out of here soon, I want to toss this question to you to get us started, which is this idea that women exist in this like historical conundrum. So other scholars have talked about this. Dr. Sherry Tucker, who I mentioned at the very beginning, she talks about this a lot in her work, which is to say that when we talk about women in music, either from a first person narrative or as an omniscient historian looking at women and their work, women exist in this kind of paradox, which is that, you know, women are either celebrated as an inevitable part of music history, which is true, or they're talked about as being underrepresented or mistreated, or, which is also true, or, and hopefully we're seeing less of this, they're totally ignored from the canon in lieu of narratives about male musicians, which we do still see, but perhaps not as much. So what are your ideas or suggestions for scholars or general people interested in learning about popular music and where women sit in that? What are your ideas or suggestions about how to deal with this conundrum of studying women as being both in music and left out of music? And how do we effectively talk about women's histories in a way that women are not continually perceived as being tokens of diversity, like Ellen and Megan and Judy described?
Well, I think part of the issue is that we have to throw out the ways that history is defined from its earliest iterations in the United States as a masculine thing. And so because men are this sort of central figure around which everyone rotates, particularly the individual performer guy, and no offense to him, but Bruce Springsteen, you know, that single man standing on stage, gifted musician, commercial actor, that's the standard. What we have to do is rethink how music operates in order to find the stories that these three wonderful panelists are able to tell, because they are not odd and they are not different and they're not ignored. And it's some of my, you know, one of the things about country music especially is that women were critical to defining its initial iterations, that if there were no women that there who said Southern and Western images, country and Western, should be mingled together. And it turns out those images of women that I've shown you this evening said, well, it's actually quite natural and normal. So when we make women's place and normal, as opposed to being celebratory or ignored, in some ways, feminist lenses do not help us here, because they look for the let's go beat up the guys because that's what women's history is. No. And in fact, many female musicians like Loretta Lynn will eschew the feminist label, just because they're singing about, it needs to be normalized. Because I would argue that all three of your panelists would say, me playing drums, me being a backup singer and a songwriter, me being a musician is normal. There is nothing different about me doing it. I'm as good. But I think Megan brought up a really important point in when she said, I have to bring my A+++ game, that the expectations of women to be treated, you know, it's women have to act twice as well to get paid half as much. And Megan, what you're pointing out, and in really poignant terms, is that you have to be as good or better to be called half as much. And so I'm wondering to the panelists if that rings true for you in some ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I probably speak for all of us when I say, and I do, and I can attest to this theme being brought up multiple times throughout the various oral histories in this collection, which is this idea that in order to exist as a woman in this field, you have to be better, not just as good, but you have to be better. And so it sort of introduces this level of self-competition, but also competition within your field that a lot of people never have to consider, particularly our male counterparts don't even consider as, a requirement. So thank you for bringing that up. So I'll punt it over really quickly before we go to each of our panelists. What do you think are workable solutions to this diversity problem as the historical actors that we're sort of propping up as our, this is normal and this is what you do and this is what women have always done in this industry. What do you think, and Ellen, you kind of alluded to this, that systemic changes need to happen. What do you think are those workable solutions to this problem? Let's start with you, Ellen.
I think you've sold me on oral histories. I think that's a good move overall, because scholars and journalists need to focus not only on the types of music careers that we can see. There are women in Nashville playing on Broadway in wedding bands and jazz and blues and rock, and their careers are just as valid and as important. And in fact, as we uplift those stories, we will create more opportunities in the mainstream for them. In general, it would help to have more data. I am a spreadsheet-oriented human being, so I have spreadsheets of all of the women I know who work in touring. I have spreadsheets of the BIPOC people I know who work in touring. And it used to be in an earlier version of the Nashville music industry, you could get some of this information, although perhaps not the demographic information, you could get some of this information from the union. As Tennessee has become a right to work state, the power of the union, the music union, AFM, is very different now. And the union just doesn't have all of the information. And I just wish there was a centralized way, other than, my own Google Drive. I wish that there was a centralized way to get this information from, like labels or business managers, but that presents all kinds of roadblocks, especially in terms of privacy, because you'd be talking about payroll. It's a really complicated, decentralized system of who's doing what, and it changes all the time. Even if you were able to get that information from artists and stuff, it would be changing at the drop of a hat. I don't know that I've helped at all.
You've helped. You've presented some really interesting ideas about various ways that we could be thinking about how to quantify what it is that you do, but also promote what you do for how normative it actually is. Because I think the perception is that there aren't that many of you out there, but the reality is that there are tons of you, not just in Nashville, but in general. So,
right. And not to overstay my welcome on this question, but this is something that I believe very strongly, which is that because women don't see themselves in these positions, they often go to these sidemen in other genres, or they become artists, and they are gaining skills in those areas that are totally applicable to country music. Country music is not rocket science. And so we can grab people who are working in those other genres and other areas, and we just need to have more lists of them.
I agree. Megan, what do you have any comments on that? Like what you think are workable solutions to this diversity problem of women in your position?
I guess my simple answer is just hire more women, and not just the ones who look like the tall, hot, long-haired, player of whatever instrument, because that happens often as well. So it's like, okay, there is a woman and she deserves a job. Obviously, it's not like discounting because she's hot, but oftentimes when I do see women in those positions, it is still this kind of stereotypical kind of role. And like has been mentioned here many times, there's so many different variations of female players, both in Nashville and otherwise. So I think just, now we're probably a ways off from touring, but I know oftentimes it's like there's hesitation to hire women for those roles if there's like mostly men because of so many ridiculous reasons that we won't get into. But I think just, you know, encouraging like labels and artists and different people to hire the kind of women that they wouldn't even normally think to do so in the first place, you know, I think would be a huge step. And again, like, because we can refer to Ellen's Google data for the, just like the amount of people, women that are here, even in Nashville, that can fit those different roles. So.
Thank you. Yes. Hiring. It seems so obvious and yet so elusive to many. Judy, before we go, what is, and you'll be our final answer this evening, what are your thoughts on this workable solution?
Yeah, from a long life and a lot of, you know, changes in the industry and everything else, I'll tell you, what I think is important is to realize that we need to get out of the I deserve thing, and we need to get into I want to recommend someone, because this is a business and it's about win-win. And I would say we need to get away from the just somebody wins. We need to make it where everybody wins. And when we know each other, and I'm really glad to meet Megan and Ellen, when we know each other, we can recommend each other because that player is a great player or singer and would be really good for this person that we're recommending it to. Well, it makes us look good too. So it's just win-win-win. And it's really a level of friendship, a level of networking, a level of not being all in it to yourself. Because most of my career, I've been very lonely. I've known tons of people and felt very alone. Now it's moving towards more of a networking thing. And I really think the idea of networking and word of mouth recommending each other, women's groups, and I love seeing the women's groups that are forming, even the artists that are getting together in 3s or 4s, and, you know, even for a temporary like thing or whatever. I'm seeing it change. And I really, really encourage the idea of village, that we are a village and it takes a village to make the best music. So recommend the best people for the village.
Thank you
a lot
so
of them
much.
are women.
Yes, I agree. And thank you so much for reminding us to leave our silos and join a community of other women so that we can recommend each other and get hired and make more spreadsheets. Thank you to our audience today for watching. Again, a huge thank you to each of our brilliant panelists for being here. Please visit the Center for Popular Music's website for updates on the accession and forthcoming availability of this project titled the Women Musicians in Nashville Oral History Project, which is still open-ended and is gaining oral histories as we speak. So, and remember, in the words of Dolly Parton, if you don't like the road you're walking, start paving another one. So thank you for joining us and appreciate all of you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.